Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I'm going to talk about my experience with abuse, both sexual and emotional, and subsequent trauma. This is the final video of the little trilogy I decided to dedicate this year to mental illness, neurodivergence, the experience of pain and difference, basically. This one was the hardest to make, the hardest to structure as well, and the one with the most sensitive content as well, and I will immediately issue a content warning for grooming, rape, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and attendant repercussions on mental health. So you've been warned. Contrary to my two previous videos, I am not going to start by giving a relevant life history. Rather, I'm going to go through said history throughout the video as it pertains to the topic at hand. It is a sensitive topic, like I said, but I think it's important to talk about it and raise awareness of what can happen during and after the experience of sexual and emotional abuse. Before I start talking about my experience of abuse proper, I'd like to go over a list of risk factors that I now know made me particularly vulnerable to said abuse. It obviously doesn't mean I am responsible for what happened to me, even though I still kind of think so at times, but anyway, nor would the same risk factors make any other victim responsible for their abuse, just to be clear. A. Autism. I am autistic and somewhat disabled because of it, and this is a huge risk factor for sexual abuse and/or assault. Disabled people in general, and autistic people in particular, are more at risk of sexual abuse. This is a fact corroborated by many studies on the subject. Being disabled obviously makes one de facto more vulnerable, but obviously in different ways depending on the disability. In the case of autism, the following traits can make us more vulnerable: difficulties with social communication and understanding things between the lines, difficulties with emotional processing, emotional hypersensitivity, which can make us too attached to the wrong person, especially if we've experienced social rejection and bullying in the past, a need for routines, and cognitive rigidity, which can make leaving a toxic situation particularly difficult. Because better the devil you know than transitioning to the unknown, if you see what I mean. B. Mental illness. This obviously intersects heavily with the vulnerability imparted by being autistic. Things like depression and anxiety can also affect executive function, a bit like autism does, and both can isolate, which then makes one more desperate to, well, find a special someone who will understand and cherish them. C. Asynchronous development. Being twice exceptional can lead to what is called an asynchronous development, wherein intellectual development goes faster than emotional development. This itself can then also lead to social isolation, a feeling of alienation from one's peers, and thus a greater resultant trust in adults, all the while still being a child or a young teenager vulnerable to the predations of said adults. So, to recap these first 3 points, when I met my rapist, age 12, I was autistic, still am, severely depressed, socially anxious, without any friends, and felt naturally more trustful of adults because I could more easily talk about so-called grown-up interests in certain situations. But there's something else I also need to add. D. Previous experience of sexual violence, in my case, molestation. Aged 8, I was molested by my cousin, who was 13 at the time. Now, I'm being precise with my vocabulary here for a reason. There was no penetration, ergo no rape. I do remember what happened relatively clearly, and I remember not liking it, and also being afraid I'd become pregnant, which would have been impossible, thankfully. For the longest time, I pretty much ignored this incident and didn't think it had much of a lasting impact. Today I'm less sure, though. I didn't tell the whole of it to my parents at the time, only recently, and I couldn't tell you why, honestly. Also, I don't harbor any resentment towards the cousin in question. He apologized to me several years ago, and I am on good terms with him. He was a messed up kid at the time himself, and I think when something like that is done by such a young perpetrator, they can definitely change and learn from their mistakes. So please no bashing my cousin in the comments is what I'm saying, I guess. But the fact is, it did probably impact me negatively because I did develop a very strong aversion to boys my age, except for my childhood best friend, I suppose. That lasted until quite recently, actually. Up until a couple of years ago, I could not conceive of men my age as well, men, and thus potential partners. My point here is previous experience of sexual violence is known. to put one at greater risk of experiencing it again, so I cannot discount this as an additional risk factor, because it probably was. My first major mental breakdown happened when I transitioned from primary to secondary school, as I've talked about in my 2 previous videos. I developed school phobia and was sent to the Children's Hospital Psych Unit for 7 weeks, from April to June 2005. Teachers would sometimes come to the unit to dispense lessons so patients could keep up with their schooling. That's where I first encountered Guy, the science and maths teacher, for the very first time, but I only really met him once I attended Robert Dubois, the hospital's dedicated school, the following autumn, so autumn of 2005. My psych team had decided I would follow my secondary school's second-year curriculum there for a year, to ease me back, if you will, into a regular school environment. Robert Dubois was indeed gentler on my social anxiety and general feelings of alienness, because the classes were very small and the teachers were on friendlier terms with their students. Each student had a reference teacher. Mine was named Jacques, the history and French teacher, but I was also a budding science nerd, so I got on friendly terms with Guy. Or rather, he got on friendly terms with me. I remember distinctly seeing him being very affectionate with a girl who didn't stay very long at the school, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. Now I think very differently about this, of course. It's certainly true he liked speaking with the students, and with me in particular, because I was very interested in his subject, and also loved talking about books and religion. He thought I was very mature for my age, very intelligent. As an aside, he actually guessed at the fact I was intellectually gifted, and he got close to me all throughout that school year. He would comfort me when I had a bad day, when I felt extra depressed, put a hand on my shoulder, on my knee, things like that. At some point, we also started chatting on MSN Messenger, and he also gave me gifts. Guy wanted to take me out during lunch hours as well, but the school refused there, citing insurance reasons. He accompanied me to some of my end-of-year exams back at my original school, and this the school didn't like, but they couldn't actually prevent it. After the school year ended, we continued chatting and also talked on the phone. I also went to his place a couple of times. Nothing strictly untoward ever happened there, though he did cuddle with me once in the couch, and when his older teenage son saw us, he did seem pretty disgusted. It's also at this point I should clarify something. My parents were not entirely okay with any of this. But you have to understand they were pretty desperate to see me happy, or at least happier, and full of life, and at first they genuinely thought Guy was a benevolent presence in my life. Grooming also works on parents, as an FYI, it must be said. Their reaction was perhaps a little delayed, sure, but please don't think ill of them, they really did the best they could given the complicated circumstances at the time. 2 incidents of note. I don't have any direct memory of this, but Guy did once ask me whether I'd already menstruated. And per the transcript I have of this chat my mother saved back then, I was apparently disturbed by this question, though he quickly brushed my concerns aside. What I do remember, however, is going to the swimming pool with him and my parents, and him mentioning he'd had an erection, seeing me in a bathing suit afterwards on Messenger. This actually did elicit strong disgust on my part, but I pushed it down and away because I'd already developed a very strong attachment to him. A toxic, twisted infatuation I unfortunately carried inside of me for 7 years. Guy took me to a museum one afternoon in late summer and kissed me for the first time. I didn't like it at first, then I did. A lot. And it does fill me with shame to say this, but it is the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, in specifically fucked up contexts, victims feel pleasure from their abuse. By that time, however, my parents had become very uneasy with the situation and asked Guy over for dinner, during which they told him to back the fuck away from me, basically. I wasn't there, but I was told later on that Guy replied I was the one who'd come on to him, but I was the one obsessed with him, etc., etc. He is, amongst other things, an abject coward. Now, I'm fuzzy on the exact timeline, but I'm pretty sure he came over one last time to help me with my maths homework. I should add I'd gone back to my regular school by that point, and it is that same evening that he raped me for the first time, right over there. In fact, in this very bedroom, he kissed me, ran his hands over me, and then deflowered me with his fingers. I remember this very distinctly, and well, I was basically frozen in place, not exactly sure what was happening. There was some blood in my panties afterwards, so he put them in his trouser pocket, I think, and laughed it off. Shortly after, I asked my mother if I could go to the movies with him. She said no, that I couldn't see him anymore, and I had a kind of meltdown? I'm not sure what it was, but it led me to doing one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. I faked a suicide attempt and freaked my parents out, to say the least. And I don't even know why I did it or what I thought it would accomplish, quite frankly, but I regretted it immediately. After that, my parents staged a kind of intervention with my shrinks. I freaked out yet again, tried running out of the room, and screamed bloody murder that I hated my parents. It wasn't true, but teenage dramatics, am I right? I was shipped off to the psych ward again for a week, during which my parents were borderline blackmailed into going to the police. I want to stress here that the shrinks at the children's hospital knew of Guy's questionable behavior, again, to say the least. They flat out knew, but had never done anything about it until then. So I do hold them responsible, just to be clear. An inquest was opened and pretty much fobbed, according to my lawyer, who has access to the old case file. But it was ultimately dropped because I would have had to go in front of a judge, and my parents didn't want to put me through the trauma of it. Once again, please understand that my parents did what they thought was best for my well-being here. Plus, they didn't actually know I'd been raped, and wouldn't know for many years. Before my phone was taken away at the hospital, I managed to alert Guy, and after that, well, to be honest, I don't really know. I no longer have my earliest diaries, which covered that time period. What I do know is that I kept in touch with Guy despite everything, and I had PIV sex, or rape, I should say, for the first time with him under a holly bush, of all things, in the woods, in the summer of 2008. I was 14 years old. After that, Guy freaked out, said I hadn't been discreet enough, and cut all contact with me for 8 months. Just like Vanessa Y in My Dar Vanessa or Daphne Greensley in Putney, I was in love with my abuser and rapist. Now, I don't personally think it was real love as such, but more poisonous infatuation that developed both as a defense mechanism and a consequence of me being neurodivergent, lonely, and emotionally vulnerable. And sure, I'm willing to admit me saying this is probably partly a coping mechanism to deflect from the sheer repulsiveness of the whole thing, but that's just the way it is. Still, technically speaking, Guy was my first love, my first lover too, and believe me, there are no words to convey how fucking horrible that fact is. The story of our relationship, because that is what it was at the end of the day, is difficult to convey, in large part because it was secret and because it went through 3 separate 8-month periods where there wasn't any contact between the two of us. Each time, it was Guy who dumped me and railed against me for failing to be secretive enough. I was the one responsible, you see, for everything, always. So, to summarize, Guy and I spoke to one another and had sporadic sexual encounters all throughout my later secondary school years, between October of 2008 and May of 2009, between October of 2009 and May of 2010, and my first 2 years at university between January of 2010 and August of 2012, a couple of months before my 20th birthday. What I want to focus on here are the consequences being in this relationship had on my mental health and my relationship to sex and sexual love. For one thing, having a secret, please forgive me, May December romance, as I viewed it back then, only furthered my feelings of alienation from my same-aged peers. It increased my social isolation, but mind-washed, mind-raped even as I was, I took it on as a mantle of edgy bad girlness no one could possibly guess I, the weird little anglophone nerd, was wearing. It's very stupid, I know, but I can't go back in time and slap sense it to 14, 15, 16, or 17-year-old me. Don't get me wrong, being autistic, gender non-conforming, and mentally ill did plenty on their own to make me feel different from everyone else, but being groomed into an abusive relationship with a man 36 years my senior did not help. At times, I flirted with semi-provocative behavior and would talk about sex to a couple of boys in my class just so I could flaunt my knowledge of the subject. In all fairness, human sexuality is a legit special interest of mine, but there was definitely some trauma-based fucked upness going on there there as well. Ironically, even though guys my age sort of repulsed me, I also had this weird low self-esteem thing going on wherein I thought of myself as fundamentally unattractive to my masculine peers. Again, it's pretty pathetic, all things told, and I'm not even sure why or how that was even a thing in my brain, but also, in all honesty, I still kind of think this today, even though I had a relationship with a man my age. And again, it flopped spectacularly, so perhaps that's why this feeling has cropped back up again recently. Sexual abuse, child sexual abuse in particular, can lead to risky and promiscuous behavior and make one extra vulnerable to re-victimization, like I already said. My experience certainly confirms this. Now again, even with the caveat that human sexuality is a special interest of mine, and that I think of myself as a naturally high libido and sexually enthusiastic woman, within the context of a love-based relationship though, I can't deny some of that generally might have been hyper-stimulated by my experience of abuse. Because of Guy, two things happened. One, I went on the internet not just to research sex, sexuality, and erotic art and literature. I also went on the internet to talk to strangers, adult strangers, about these things without really realizing what I was doing. I went on forums and talked about sex to grown-ass men who knew I was a teenager like it was nothing. Now, the ease with which I can talk about sex with guys in this case is not something I find negative overall, to be clear, but in that context, it was dangerous. Once I even drew a random man's penis. True story. I thought I was doing an edgy art thing, but let's be real, the dude in question probably jerked off to it. And yes, my naivete there was also probably partly due to the autism. And two, I went on the internet to talk about the tragedy of my forbidden love story and find sympathy. Of course, there was very little of it to be found. Duh. But here's the unfortunate thing. Being told I was being abused and brainwashed only made me dig my heels in deeper. My dog Vanessa actually illustrates this behavior perfectly. There was, however, one exception. A user by the name of the Big Bad Wolf. His username was in French actually, was Le Grand Méchant Loup, but it means the Big Bad Wolf. I swear you can't make this shit up. He started talking with me and he offered me all the emotional support I could want. This was Denis, a French man, 33 years my senior, I later dated as a young adult. So he's one of my exes. Denis is the shy and solitary intellectual type, and he and I started talking about lots of different things besides my relationship with Guy. He told me I was exceptionally mature for my age, incredibly intelligent, you see the pattern here? And commiserated with me on being misunderstood for my forbidden love. We started exchanging emails, talked on MSN Messenger, and he fell in love with me. I started reciprocating his feelings, or at least I think I did. I stated in my autism video that I struggle with purely platonic love, that if I get sufficiently emotionally close to someone, physical attraction tends to develop in concert, so that must have played a part, but I was also a brainwashed grooming and rape victim. And emotional processing, alexithymia, is an issue in autism, so I don't really know anymore. I do believe I genuinely felt affection for Denis, and it's because of this I started reading about ethical non-monogamy, polyamory, etc. I believed in soulmates when I fell under Guy's spell, and crafted this tragic love story narrative to help me make sense of everything. With Denis, I started wondering if one could have several soulmates, etc. It became a mess in my head over the years, believe me, and I sort of came back around to believing in soulmates with my ex David, but then that crashed into the ground. In any case, I started thinking of Guy as my principal epic love, and of Denis as my secondary love. I want to slap 15-year-old me so bad right now. Oh, yes, I forgot to mention, I met Denis when I was 15 years old. And yes, I know how fucking bad that alone looks. Denis came to Brussels for work in the summer of 2008, I think, and we met in the woods. Those woods have seen some shit. But see the risky behavior there? No way I would do that today. But teenage me thought it was nothing, I guess. Denis and I kissed, sex was tried, but he couldn't get it up. I came home hours later, and my parents definitely knew something fishy was up, but I weathered their questioning and stayed stoically silent. Though I think my mother did find his phone number at some point, and she called him and left a very angry message and scared the living daylights out of him. It's kind of ironic because later on they actually met and they got along. Life is really messy sometimes. By the end of 2008, Guy came back in the picture, and Denis wasn't too pleased about it. The thing is, Denis never criticized Guy for fucking, a 13 then 14-year-old. He only criticized his ungentlemanly behavior when he cancelled a date last minute, and he told me, Guy is really manipulating you, which, to be fair, was true. But yes, quite simply, I think he was jealous. Denis also loved Lolita, the Vladimir Nabokov Lolita, for the wrong reasons, and we often talked about that as well. He called me his nymph, given I was too old to be a nymphette, and because I was interested in mythology, nature, and paganism as well. To be fair. 1 or 2 years later, when my parents were away on vacation, Denis came to my home and we tried having sex again, but the minute he lied down on top of me, I had the most violent, visceral, nope reaction ever. There again, I'm not entirely sure what happened. I like to think my body had a moment of radical awareness and tried to protect me, but I really don't know. It certainly cooled things down between us, but we remained friends. Denis had a girlfriend after that, an adult, but much younger than him. He stayed with until shortly before we got together during the summer of 2012. Now, I'm sure most of you, given what I've just talked about, would have very negative things to say about my ex Denis, and I can't fault you for any of it. I have shed so many tears rereading some of the emails he sent me when I was a teenager, because between my rapist and my abusive ex Philippe, he was supposed to be the good one, the safe one, but our relationship was tainted from the very start. That being said, I'd like to stress the following. Reality can be extremely messy, even when it comes to this particular subject. Denis had a problem. He was definitely a phobophiliac, I think is what it's called. And yes, he did things that were morally wrong, but I do not believe he is a fundamentally bad person. Certainly not like my rapist Guy is, and he never did anything criminal as far as I know, unless our quasi-tryst in the woods was illegal. I guess it kind of was given my age, but I don't want to linger on that. I had an intimate relationship with him between the ages of 20 and 23, and he was always kind, affectionate, and respectful of my intellect and opinions. I traveled with him to several places in Europe and have overall positive memories of our time together. Stained memories, but still overall positive. Moreover, he didn't treat me like garbage when it was over between us, which I can't even say of the best relationship I ever had with my ex David. So yes, things aren't always purely black and white is my point. Though I'll admit I had to completely cut ties with him because, well, like I said, I can no longer unsee certain things. As I stated before, my relationship with Guy carried on and off throughout my teenage years. Every time he dumped me for a period of 8 months, you can imagine my depression worsened, my anxiety worsened, and my despair, accompanied by suicidal ideation, flared up. I felt abandoned, quite frankly, and the instability inherent in our relationship really messed with me. How can you trust in the future when things break up out of seemingly nowhere? Of course, the relationship was poison, and I'm glad I got out of it, but the point is that that kind of messed up emotional situation is terrible for self-esteem, trust, and, hopefulness. But this is something I'll get back to. I certainly had a skewed perception of reality where Guy was concerned. He pumped me full of delusional aspirations, living together, getting married, etc. If only I could wait for him until I turned 18. But, he certainly didn't wait. So when he remarried in 2009, I naturally felt betrayed, and, well, became a mistress at the tender age of 17. The bastard had the gall to say it was my and my parents' fault. If the cops hadn't been on his ass, he wouldn't have needed to buy himself a respectable facade in the shape of an older religious wife. Why, of course, that makes perfect sense. To the surprise of absolutely no one, I'm sure, Guy never had any qualms about cheating on her with me. He even once told me that if he didn't come inside of me, it didn't count as adultery. How budding feminist me could swallow that is beyond me. In fact, Guy mostly berated his wife in my presence and moaned incessantly about her religious bigotry and her jealousy. Jealous she certainly was. One time, right before Guy hooked up with me again for the last period of our relationship, I even received an email from her accusing me of harassing her husband. If I didn't stop, she said, she would go to the police. That is god-tier irony if I've ever seen it. In any case, fast forward to 2012. I spent a few days in Vienna with Denis, and to make a long story short, we got together. together. I was still technically with a guy as well, though, so I decided to see him one last time in August. And the most incredible thing happened. The minute I saw him, a wall came crashing down in my mind, and I no longer felt anything for him. No amorous feelings, no strong feelings of affection or attachment, and certainly no desire. I broke up with him then, said we could remain friends, and we did keep in touch for a few months after that, but I was basically rid of him. Make no mistake though, I didn't see myself as a victim of anything, and I didn't see him as a rapist or a predator or both. I still had a long way to go. And so, like I previously said, I had a relationship with Denis for 3 years after that. Towards the end of that relationship, I became increasingly tired of some of his old-fashionedness. I lost my desire, but not so much affection for him. And that's when I met Philippe. I'm going to try and summarize this as much as possible because this relationship lasted 6 years of my life and was a fucking mess. Which is kind of the running theme for my relational history, really. I met Philippe at a day psychiatric clinic, Le Quotidien, in 2015. He suffers from chronic depression like me and is an unreformed alcoholic. I'd argue he probably has borderline personality disorder as well, but it's not my place to diagnose him. He's also 21 years older than I am, so I do want to address the age thing here. I am not specifically attracted to older men, and by older, I mean older by 10 plus years. If I ever was that, it is firmly over. I didn't seek out Denis because he was much older than me, nor did I specifically become attracted to Philippe because he was older than me. It just happened that way. Though, okay, I do believe carrying that weird trauma-informed disgust for men my age, but not women, and having much older parents didn't help. The latter especially, I think, played a part because oftentimes younger people are disgusted by the idea of dating people their parents' ages. My parents are quite older than the average for people my age, and they were always older than my partners, so I didn't have that instinctive reaction. Also, having Guy as my first love probably just imprinted a certain template onto my brain, but like I said, all that's thankfully gone. Philippe has a frustrated artistic temperament and likes some animals and fairy tale-like things a bit, though more, I'm sorry, this is gonna sound mean, but it's the truth, more like a sad man longing for childhood than a nerd like me. So I guess that and his looks are what initially attracted me to him. The fact he was a bit of an outsider, even at the clinic, and that there was a certain poetic darkness to him I could somewhat misguidedly relate to, also contributed to it. Beyond that superficial veneer of similarity, however, we really don't have that much in common at all, which is why I'm still kind of flabbergasted I stayed with him so bloody long. Then again, the intensity of autistic affection, as I'm going to call it, sue me, loneliness, low self-esteem, sexual frustration, and low standards from previous abuse probably have a lot to answer for me sticking around longer than was good for me. In short, our relationship lasted from the summer of 2015 to the summer of 2021, though it started dying about a year before. We were never officially a couple, but existed in this in-between, ill-defined state of emotional connection and occasional sexual relationship, which definitely lacked a sense of stability or a sense of security. Right before we hooked up for the first time, he told me he didn't want a girlfriend, that he wasn't made to be in a romantic relationship. He has issues with women, sex, and love, to put it mildly, but then I guess that has kind of been the case with all of my exes to a greater or lesser degree. Much to unpack there anyway. I said I was fine with that because I was under, once again, the misguided notion that ethical non-monogamy and relationship anarchy were the way forward for me. I don't think this anymore, though I don't reject everything I've learned from those subjects either. And besides, the non-monogamous behavior that happened during that relationship was not exactly ethical and fully embraced. But I'll get back to that in a minute. I was also under the misguided, largely unconscious notion that the sex I'd get with him would be tied into love and would foster greater emotional intimacy. I was very wrong on that front. But at first, I didn't mind so much because a part of me enjoyed messing around with Philippe behind the clinic staff's back. Here again, I now find zero pleasure in any kind of secretive behavior, but a part of me was undoubtedly still running on abuse victim software at the time and trying, I guess, to resolve what had happened with Guy. My relationship with Philippe, just like my relationship with Guy, had many ups and downs. There were month-long periods during which we didn't see each other, only spoke on the phone because he was either too drunk and miserable to see me or he was in the hospital. The sex we had was infrequent, as was the affection he showed me, and it was almost always tied into the consumption of alcohol on his part. He did say he loved me several times, that I was the woman of his life even, and towards the end he said he'd finally concluded we had in fact been a couple, which, funnily enough, actually means he cheated on me 3 separate times. Not that I entirely see it that way, even today, but so, yes, Philippe was more or less my partner, close enough in any case, so that is why I consider him an ex. Now onto that toxic / abusive behavior. I'll try and keep this as tidy and easy to follow as possible. A. Emotional / caring asymmetry. I expended way more emotional energy and care into my relationship with Philippe than he ever did. There was a severe lack of symmetry or reciprocity in the way we took interest in one another, in the ways we cared for one another. I wanted to know everything about Philippe, because when I fall in love or love someone, they kind of become a special interest, a special person. But he wanted to keep me a mystery, which honestly felt to me like a form of objectification, and would often tell me I'm not interested whenever I tried talking about my past, my life experiences, or my interests with him. My inner life didn't matter all that much, whereas I took the time to become acquainted with whatever interested him. I always listened to the music he sent me. I went out with him to look at clothes, even though I have no interest in fashion, etc. He would often ask me to buy things online for him, print porn images for him. Yes, I know, I was a dumbass. Because he didn't know how to do it, nor did he care to learn. He's a big technophobe, you see. I'm the one who went to his house one night to pick him off the kitchen floor after he'd drunk an entire bottle of cognac. I'm the one who consoled him, amongst other things, with sex I didn't really want, when he broke up with the first woman he sort of cheated on me with. And I'm the one who let him up into my home at 1 o'clock in the morning, drunk out of his mind, to hear him whine about how women were making his life too difficult. I'm also the one who tried finding him alternative clinics and therapies for his depression and alcoholism, but he never did anything with the information, of course. And yes, I am painfully aware I come across as dreadfully pathetic here. I admit I had no self-respect, clearly. But the point is he never gave me emotional support anywhere close to the amount I gave him. Except when my Lily died. I'll give him that. But it is the exception that proves the rule. Inconsistent / hot and cold behavior. Philippe is the most inconsistent person I've ever met, barring post-breakup David, and I never felt secure or on stable ground with him. He was also an expert at switching between hot and cold behavior, and this was very strongly tied to his alcoholism. One minute he would tell me how much he loved me, be decently cuddly. The next he would become cold as an iceberg, barely acknowledge me as someone important in his life, and would generally lack empathy. And believe me when I say this hot and cold behavior in particular was very, very difficult to deal with. And I mean, I am autistic, so emotional processing is already difficult for me to begin with, so yes, that was psychologically violent at times, yes, I'm gonna say that. He would also flake out on dates and outings all the time, but when he decided he wanted to see me, he would beg and plead I come over, even if I didn't really want to, until I inevitably folded. He changed his mind about his thoughts and feelings all the time and would cut conversations short the second he realized I was knowledgeable about a subject, and he wasn't, and he would have to listen for a change instead of speak. There were also many inconsistencies between his words and his actions. He would tell me he had heard my complaints, because I did issue complaints after a while, but there knew nothing to change his behavior. Or he would often tell me when I came up with something that bothered me that he hadn't really meant whatever it was that he'd said because he'd had a drink. Narcissism, and it's not a great word for it, but I'm going to call it dominating behavior. Philippe was incredibly self-centered and always brought everything back to himself. When we talked on the phone, He talked on the phone, really. Talked for hours at a time without once asking me how I was doing. Though he did make an effort on that front later on, I'll give him that. If I started talking about something I was interested in, or about a personal experience, he would, 9 times out of 10, cut it short, like I said, and bring the conversation back to his own interests or life experiences. And when I cut myself, he thought I did it to get back at him. He also often acted with complete disregard for my feelings or desires. He was the one in charge, the one who got to set the terms of our relationship, and I basically had nothing to say about it. He also tried to change me physically a little, told me I should change the way I dress, should start wearing heels and makeup. I think he was trying to make me more feminine, really. And once even shamed me into shaving my legs in front of him. I felt absolutely awful, and I hate myself that I actually complied. Finally, the very last time we had sex, he was a little too rough, and I started bleeding. He freaked out, not because he was concerned for me, though, but because blood made him queasy. I was very upset, as you can imagine, but all Philippe could think to do was ask me to finish him off. When I asked to cuddle afterwards, however, he said, as he often had in the past, he wasn't in the mood. To be very clear here, Philippe never raped or assaulted me, right? But I definitely did sometimes feel sexually used and sullied with him. Miscellaneous. Beyond his alcoholism, Philippe had a mild pornography addiction, and this bled into his sexual behavior. He's also had extensive experience with prostitutes, which for me is now a red flag. He had mother issues, another running theme to greater and lesser degrees with my exes, actually. Mildly sexist attitudes towards women at times. Yes, I'm a feminist, what the fuck was I doing with him? I know, I can't change the past. And an inferiority complex, definitely. He would often be very patronizing towards me, hypocritical to boot, and clearly felt threatened by my intellectual disposition, shall we say. He would either mock my braininess or accuse me of being too arrogant, too cerebral, or too robotic. And when I made the mistake of telling him I was intellectually gifted, he told me the reason I was alone and didn't have any friends was because I was too smart and thus too alien. He also disparaged his girlfriends a lot and wallowed in self-pity more often than not, and he also indulged in emotional blackmail from time to time, especially when he was, like, blackout drunk. Gaslighting and deflection. I felt increasingly uncomfortable and frustrated with Philippe as the years went by, but I couldn't really put a name to my feelings. That's the alexithymia. I wanted to believe, needed to believe things could get better if only I explained everything clearly enough to him, but that never worked. I tried and tried again, yet every time Philippe would either minimize my feelings or turn to self-pity and half-heartedly apologize, drunk and crying for his bad behavior. But nothing ever stuck. After almost losing me for the first time, Philippe told me he didn't understand why I didn't seem to love him anymore, when he'd realized he adored me and wanted to spend all his time with me. What had happened to us, he asked me. Why didn't I write him little cards anymore? And, like a dumbass, I would fall for it and feel very guilty. Towards the end of our relationship, when he sort of cheated on me for the 3rd time, he flat out told me, as I was having a panic attack in front of him no less, that I was being immature and hysterical, making mountains out of nothing. And one of the very last things he ever said to me was that I should have known when I first met him and learned he was a chronically depressed alcoholic, that all that followed would happen. Yes, my friends, it was my fault for not being ableist enough and judging his character solely on his mental illness, basically. I wasn't enough of a shitty person, apparently. Finally, emotional disregard and cheating. I've alluded a couple of times now to Philippe sort of cheating on me. Like I said, we were never officially a couple, but there was a bond between us, and I was certainly very emotionally invested in our relationship for a long time. Philippe had told me clearly he didn't want a girlfriend and that he thought romantic love was more or less bullshit. But he also loved me, and I should note that in ethically non-monogamous practice, it is understood everyone will do their best to be as transparent as humanly possible and discuss everything beforehand with everyone to avoid hurting feelings and minimize jealousy. So, when Philippe dated one woman in 2016 and casually dated another in 2018, it wasn't so much the fact he was having sex with those women that bothered me. It was One, the fact he stopped having sex with me, even though I still wanted to, but more importantly too, the fact I was, as a consequence, relegated against my wishes to the position of a third wheel. A dirty secret even, because his girlfriends tended to be jealous, and he didn't want them to know he had a close female friend he'd had sex with. I just had to deal with it. Then in 2020, after an umpteenth hospital stay, Philippe did it again. Right after he told me things would be better between us and more physically intimate to boot. But no, he started dating a woman he'd known at the hospital all of 2 weeks, told me he didn't know much about her or her illness, but that he was in love and that I, the woman who'd cared for him for the past 5 years, would have to take a back seat. This basically delivered the first death blow to our relationship, and my mental health was in an abysmal state at that time, and Philippe acting like a massive asshole to me yet again didn't help. It took this final crisis for me to realize just how toxic my relationship with Philippe was. That it was, in fact, emotionally/psychologically abusive. But I wouldn't have used those words on my own had I not researched the topic on the good old internet. I thought emotional abuse was the kind of thing that happened with, I don't know, narcissistic sociopaths, sadists, or neglectful, abusive parents. But the truth is that it can happen in many different circumstances. To this day, however, I do not believe Philippe ever purposefully meant to hurt me, and even though I've painted a very negative picture of our relationship, I did spend some nice moments with him as well. Again, life is rarely purely black and white, right? I do believe as well a large part of his behavior was due to his mental illness and alcoholism. But it was also due to his personality. He tended to, put it all on the account of alcoholism, but no, I disagree. And he does not get a free pass for bad behavior just because he is ill. As I've stated before, I am mentally ill, many other people are mentally ill, and we don't all necessarily engage in bad or abusive behavior. Philippe was basically like a rowdy child in a china shop, breaking all manner of pots and vases without really meaning to, but when he was told to stop, he refused. My relationship with him survived a while longer. Then we had our penultimate falling out, if you will, when I was at the hospital between December of 2020 and March of 2021. After that, we talked a few more times on the phone because I folded to his requests, basically. We exchanged a few final emails, but the spell was broken, thankfully, and I basically ended the relationship right around the time my ex David got in touch with me for the first time. The very last email I received from Philippe simply said, "Bitch." I no longer feel any attachment to Philippe, and I question whether I really loved him as much as I thought I did, but that's personal stuff to get sorted. Nor do I even feel anger at this point. I just mostly pity him, really. However much harm I suffered from this relationship, it ironically had the positive side effect of making me realize just how fucked up my relationship with Guy had been as well, and eventually how fucked up my entire relational history had been, really. The toxic aspects of my relationship with Philippe basically acted as giant triggers, if you will, but the process was initiated by me reading a couple of books. The novel My Dark Vanessa, written by Kate Elizabeth Russell, and the memoir Consent, written by Vanessa Springora. Both stories, fictional and real life, mirrored my experience of grooming, sexual and emotional abuse in ways I could no longer ignore. Quite simply. I talked about all of it long and hard with my mother, and slowly came to terms with the fact that I had been raped, both in body and mind. And reading the novel Putney, written by Sofka Zinoviev, basically concluded this process of initial acceptance. That is the power of literature in a nutshell. Anecdotally, the fact I also had an increasing number of bad dreams featuring Guy either raping me or coaxing me into half-desired and half-unwanted sex also clued me into the fact something had indeed been very wrong with our relationship. The final nail in the coffin, however, was Guy contacting me in September of 2020. Full disclosure though, I also met him for coffee in 2018 and exchanged a few messages with him on Facebook Messenger after he reached out to me. Why? Because I was curious, and because, quite frankly, the ghost of the brainwashed girl I had been still haunted my psyche in an encysted little part of my brain. I wanted to see if he still, wanted me, even though the sight of him repulsed me. And he very much did want me, for the record, and wanted to come over at my place. But I refused, partly because I was actually scared I would have let myself be fucked by him. That's the toxic power of grooming and abuse. And in any case, he blocked me shortly after that. But so, in the autumn of 2020, I received an email from him, out of the blue, asking me how I was getting on with life. A couple of back and forths later, he clearly stated he wanted me to be his mistress again. Yay. Something in me broke then, and to make a long story short, I got him to fess up to his crime in writing on Skype Messenger, photocopied excerpts from various diaries that proved we had had a relationship, printed various emails I'd received from him over the years, and established an elaborate timeline. Then I got a lawyer and went to the police with her during my stay at the hospital in early March of 2021. In fact, my deposition was on the 1st of March. As of today, the investigation is still ongoing, but according to my lawyer, who is a wonderful woman, by the way, it should conclude this month, actually. Then, with some luck, the case will go to trial, and fingers crossed. I've talked about what happened with my ex David in my last reading wrap-up, if you want to check that out, and I don't have the emotional fortitude to go over it again in depth. I still cry every day about this. But for those of you who are familiar with my story there, I hope you now have a better understanding of just why the end of that relationship has been so devastatingly hard on me. Being who I am, being autistic, and mentally ill, it's hard to find a partner in the first place, a good partner, and harder still to find someone who more or less naturally understands you, understands the way you think and function. Relationships are hard, especially for neurodivergent people, and, very tiring and draining. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't tired with David. Sorry. I wasn't tired with him. We were ridiculously compatible on so many levels. It was such a gift, and I felt full of life, love, and light with him. Losing him shattered me because I lost a person whom I still think was a soulmate. But it also shattered me because he became a monster and started emulating some of the behavior I'd seen displayed by Philippe specifically. In fact, he defended Philippe in his very last email to me, his horrible last email to me, and said I wallowed in victimhood and couldn't take responsibility for anything in my life, when he'd been nothing but lovingly supportive before. He lied, he vilified me, and tried his best to square it in his mind, I believe, to make me doubt what we'd had was real, to erase our relationship, basically. I find it telling as a result that he fucked off to Glasgow right after his last email to me, and I guess, he just couldn't face his memories or his conscience back in Stirling anymore. I wouldn't be surprised if he changes his legal name again too, honestly. He's that disturbed, paranoid, and cowardly now. My point here is that the breakup acted as another massive trigger for me. After all I've been through, I had finally found, or so I thought, a wonderful partner who loved and cherished me without objectifying me, respected me, shared my interests, who could nerd out with me to my heart's content, who was my own age, who wanted to work towards and commit to a shared future. And it shattered, or rather was shattered by him, because at the end of the day he is much more mentally ill and has much deeper issues than I first thought. Once I came to grips with the dark aspects of my relational history, to put it mildly, around the end of 2020, a few things started to happen. I started dissociating more heavily than I do naturally because of my autism, and developed a measure of loathing for my female body. I felt I inhabited a corpse, or a piece of spoiled meat, that general imagery, and felt like my body and pieces of my soul had been stolen. Fun fact, the etymology for the word rape is the same as that for the word to steal. You're welcome. I started cutting on my breasts and my belly to cope, whereas before I'd only cut my arms and legs. I don't do that specifically anymore, just as an FYI. I couldn't look at myself naked anymore, it just distressed me too much, and I couldn't recognize my face in the mirror. Again, more severely than I do naturally because of my autism. And I also felt pains all along the left side of my body? Why the left side? You tell me. In my neck and my upper back as well. And I still do have pains in my neck and my upper back because shit, mental health. Borderline TMI, but this is part of life, so we should be able to talk about it like mature adults. I couldn't masturbate anymore without being assaulted by intrusive thoughts of the people I mentioned. And if I had an orgasm, would feel absolutely awful and honestly sick to my stomach. Orgasms are supposed to be nice things. They were not nice. I'd want to rip my sexual organs out and borderline prayed I'd lose my libido. I also had numerous bad dreams, like I previously said, and I still have bad dreams. Of all my exes, I am one haunted bitch with faulty emotional and memory processing. And I also developed mild androphobia. So androphobia meaning fear, not hatred, fear of men. Men scared me, became disgusting to me, especially older men. And at the hospital, I became terribly anxious when 2 older male patients were admitted onto my ward. So I asked the staff if I could eat in my room for a week. It was right after my deposition at the police as well, and so they granted my request. I mean, I also asked because autism-related social anxiety, right? But the arrival of those 2 male patients really pushed me over the edge. Thankfully, the sexual issues, and especially the androphobia, were largely resolved through David's loving touch, shall we say. And, well, at least now, like I said, I know I can be attracted to men my age. So that issue is over and done with as well. What clearly isn't resolved, however, is, well, everything else. My trust in others in life, in myself, is absolutely shot. It is shot because of what happened more or less recently with David. It is shot because of what happened with Philippe and Guy over several years. Maybe Denis as well, but to a lesser extent, to be fair. Being treated like a human yo-yo, as I call it, an object, a disposable love, and fucking interest one only picks out of the drawer when it is convenient, not being able to count on commitment or loyalty isn't good for one's mental health, one's sense of solidity, if that makes sense, and one's sense of trust. My self-esteem isn't great either, to say the least. In all honesty, this can also be traced back to experiencing bullying as a child, right? Like, lots of things contribute to these different things. But I have felt responsible for what happened to me. I have felt shame, and I have felt guilt. So much guilt, because I can be extremely empathetic. So I felt bad about ending my relationship with Denis, of all things. I often wondered if I was being unfair or mean to Philippe, and felt guilty about that too. Same with David, basically. And I've also indulged in what is called magical thinking, as in these bad things happen to me because I haven't been enough of a good person, etc. As I stated in my autism video, the fact that I struggle with purely platonic relationships and attachment might partly be due to the fact that I experienced prolonged sexual abuse, which can warp one's understanding and processing of sexual love. I mean, in my case, specifically, I think a natural neurodivergence-related tendency towards what I called aplatonicism in the autism video was reinforced by my experience of abuse. And finally, I might have missed or minimized red flags, even in my relationship with David. He did change his legal name to get away from his family after a bad breakup and mental breakdown after all. So now I'm just scared that if by some unlikely miracle of fate I find another potential mate, it'll turn out to be a trick of the universe and I will be hurt again. I'm also scared I'm just too broken and wounded and ugly inside because of that to attract anyone but a creep, a predator, an abuser, or someone even more severely mentally ill and unstable than I am. My psychiatrist asked me the other day if I was subconsciously attracted to meanness or toxicity, and I burst into tears because I just don't really know anymore. I don't really think so, and I mean, I did tell her David was nothing but wonderful to me when we were together, but at this point, I'm at a loss. On the plus side, I think I have identified a couple of commonalities between all of my exes, except Guy, who is a stereotypical predator in his own category, expressed to varying degrees by each of said exes. Mother issues, issues with masculinity, masculine identity, and masculine self-confidence, what I'm gonna call it, issues with intelligent and or strong-headed women, and in the case of David and Philippe, issues with addiction. So, I guess note to self here is avoid that in the future at all costs. And of course, all of this loops back into my experience of depression, anxiety, and my experience of the world and relationships as an autistic person and, an autistic woman. At the end of the day, it is one giant entangled mess. I hope, if anything, all of my 3 videos have illustrated this. Like I said, this video in particular was quite hard to script. I went days without being able to do anything because, as you can imagine, it is a painful subject to delve into. But I do hope it was informative, that it will resonate, even somewhat help some of you to feel less alone if you've experienced similar things. Once again, as with my previous 2 videos, I am more than open to respectful questions about anything. So yeah, keep that in mind if you want me to elaborate on something or another. And so, as one bookworm to other bookworms, fret not, the book content is coming back. I have 2 videos that will go up at the end of this week that I filmed a while ago, and I want to do 3 different book reviews. So yes, I will get back full-time to the delicious goodness that is literature, especially SFF literature. In the meantime, however, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Also, as an FYI, I have a playlist of book reviews for books that are related to the topic of emotional, sexual abuse, grooming, etc. So yes, do take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you all relatively soon in the next video. Bye-bye.